I'd like to welcome you to Module 5 of the Natural Systems Agriculture course. My name is Martin Entz. I'm a professor at the University of Manitoba, and it's my pleasure to share Module 5 with you. I'm just going to share my screen here, and we can get started. Module 5 is called an Integrative and Diversification Science. We're going to talk about complexity, functional diversity, stacking diversification practices, and then socioeconomic benefits. Last class, which was Module 4, we talked about plant community diversity as being central in natural systems agriculture, and I referred to this area as crop ecology. This week, we are actually going to dig a bit deeper, and we're not going to talk about only plant diversity. We're going to talk about agroecosystem diversity. So the discipline that we're talking about now is agroecology. And the four main thrusts of the lecture today is that we're going to embrace complexity beyond just crop diversity or plant diversity. Also consider pests, natural enemies, because they all operate simultaneously in the field and they interact with each other. Secondly, we mentioned in Module 4 a little bit about functional diversity, and the authors that we're going to talk about, they want us to drill down to actual traits. What are the characteristics of organisms that make them function in one way or another, and how can we use that in agroecosystem engineering? And then stacking diversification practices. And we have to do this all with a view to translating these ecological processes in agriculture, in the food system, into socioeconomic benefits, because farmers, for them, it's not only the ecological functioning that matters, which hopefully will increase their productivity and stabilize productivity, but they also have business and concerns, and they operate in a broader society. Okay, so an agroecosystem, as is shown here in this diagram, which I've shown you before in the course, associates a field with its margins, and it's embedded in a broader ecosystem. And as I mentioned earlier, the field on that, the farm that's in the white, delineated by the white lines, has a very different landscape than the farm on the right-hand side, which is much more broad fields, very, very few different crops, and very few natural features. On the right, I'm talking about what are the key descriptive practices around an agriculture that embraces this complexity. What are the tools? Well, in the paper that Hatt and Doering wrote, which is cited on the bottom of the slide here, they talk about crop rotation, cultivar mixtures, intercropping, companion planting, agroforestry, and field margin management. And those are the tools that we use in agroecological engineering. So that's a term that I'm going to come back to a number of times during this module. It's a new discipline. It's something that's very exciting. We don't understand as much as we need to, but we do understand a few things, and I want to share those with you today. Okay, so if we look at the paper by Hatt and Doering, they describe a number of different options for stacking diversity. So here we have crop rotation. And so you see layers. There's a crop in yellow here, and there was previous year, there was a crop that's green, et cetera. So that's crop rotation. So that's one form of diversity. cultivar mixtures is another form of diversity, something that we have worked with and many other people have worked with, and it does provide some benefits. And then intercropping species mixture, which is quite a powerful tool. So that's three-dimensional diversity. If we add those all together, that gives us a four-dimensional diversity. They also talk about non-crop diversity. So this is a monocrop, but with field margins that have diversity in them. And so that's a form of two-dimensional diversity, or monoculture with sole cropping is what they call monoculture, and then some kind of a diversified landscape around it. So we've got two-dimensional, three-dimensional, four-dimensional, and then if we put the whole thing together, we have five-dimensional diversity, which includes crop rotation, intercropping, field margins, diversified landscape, and cultivar mixtures. The authors go on to talk about how we think about the various components of these complex systems. The paper is called Designing Pest Suppressive Agroecosystems and Principles for an Integrative Diversification Science. So we talked about complexity. We have a lot of complexity in our farming systems. We've got, certainly weeds. We all know about those diseases or pathogens, insect pests, but we also have natural enemies of those insects. How do we manage those things? Using our tools of rotations, mixtures, diversified field margins and landscape diversity. So that's our toolbox. These are the realities of our system. And embracing it is something that we're going to talk about, and also understanding it. I'm going to leave this middle part for now. And if we do this right, it translates into socioeconomic benefits. It provides provisioning, food, provides income, and we get that through yield. It provides maybe some income stability through reducing reliance on external inputs. In some parts of the world, people are paid for their environmental services. And so that's a description of the socioeconomic benefits. And then this part here, considering traits, we're going to come back to this once in a while. It's not something I'm going to cover in a great detail here in this lecture because it is complex and it is ecology, and it's very important. But we could offer a whole course on this. Okay, so I've introduced some of the ideas of Hatt and Doering about how we think about agroecological engineering, and you can pause the video and now write down your questions or comments and put them into the soil so we can grow our ideas. All right. I'm showing you this slide mainly to draw your attention to what's in the yellow box, and that is when we see interactions in agriculture and they provide almost magical outcomes, the first thing we might be a bit skeptical, but then we say, like, why does it work? How does it work? How can it possibly work? And this example here comes from Ohio, and Larry Phelan, who published this about 15 years ago. What they did is collected soil from organic farms and conventional farms, and then they put them in pots and they released the female European corn borers into the greenhouse to look at their egg-laying preferences. And the European corn borer, or the stem borer, it always laid fewer eggs in the organic soil than the conventional soil. And you can go to the publication and take a look at what their explanation was. There is a logical explanation. And Um, and that always really is exciting and surprising that these types of things can actually happen. And I've also got a picture of Jonathan Lundgren, a colleague in South Dakota, who does a lot of work on this type of agroecological engineering, right directly on farms, focusing on insects and soil organic matter and diversity. So when we ask ourselves the question, how does it work or why does it work? Again, Hatt and Döring have provided some very good points directed at certain places within the agroecosystem. So here we have the field, we have intercropping, we have insects, and so for example, pest herbivory, um, we have insects that respond to chemical emissions from the plants. We have insects with particular diets. Um, we've got parasitism. Certain insects eat other insects. We've got allelopathy when it comes to crop plant interaction. And then if we look at these natural areas around the field, we have recruitment of natural enemies. So the type of flower morphology or flower color or how it reflects light can will dictate the type of insects that are there, and those insects can eat like the we always look at the ladybug. It can eat a lot of aphids. So these are the layers that are involved in understanding why it why it works. So let's give an example. We talked about this in module 4, but I want to come back to intercropping. Here we have work of Kristen McMillan in our university who looked at pea aphids, and when peas were grown in monoculture, there were the highest number of aphids per plant. When pea was intercropped with canola or oats or even flax, we see a drop in the aphids. And so we see that intercropping is reducing that aphid population. But the question that Canadian farmers are probably most interested in, or West Prairie farmers, is how do we do this to manage flea beetles? Flea beetles are a major pest of canola, especially early in the season, and especially in hot, dry springs. And we grow so much canola, there's just so much feed around. And this one study back in the 1990s showed that there really was not much of an effect on intercropping peas with canola for suppression of this insect pest. And then one of the farmers who's taking the course was saying, well, in my intercrops, I do see a reduction in flea beetles. And so I went looking in response to that in the literature. And here's a paper from just last year from Canada, from Alberta authors and Manitoba authors and Saskatchewan authors. And we can see the geographic spread of the flea beetle species. There's two main species, which are described here. And in their review paper, they talked a little bit about crop rotation, but there was little about intercrop benefits for flea beetle control. So sadly, there really hasn't been a lot of formal research published on this subject in our region, which is in very intensive canola growing region. But if we look at the literature and try to cobble together some theories or some understanding of whether there's some potential flea beetle control from intercropping, it looks very different. So, for example, this is a paper here from Australia. And what the authors found is that fewer eggs were laid on cabbage. Cabbage, canola is derived from cabbage when intercropped with tall compared with short red clover. So what they found is that the vertical profile of the clover really affected the ability of the clover to suppress flea beetles for the brassica, for the cabbage. And they referred to this paper that was in the previous slide, the Vice 1994, and they said that that they had concluded that a lack of camouflage of canola by low-growing pea explained that the intercropping has no effect on the abundance of the flea beetle. And so, um, maybe if we look at a picture like this, which is from France, we've got very low growing peas, and while the plant is probably through its susceptible stage for flea beetle, and the canola is much taller. Whereas if we look here at some pictures from Iharf, which is in Saskatchewan, you can see that the size of the pea is much, it's in fact looks even a little bit taller than the canola. And we would expect, based on this review, that this would indeed give some flea beetle control. And if we look at other information on flea beetles, this is work from the 1980s where they looked at the flea beetle per plant in collards, which are very desirable for flea beetles to eat. And we compare that to vetch and barley. And we can see a lot lower levels of infestation. And if we look here at mustard, which repels, which is a non-host for flea beetle, and we look at the distance when we grew collards, 1 meter or 7 meters or almost 10 meters away, you can see as we move away from this plant that suppresses flea beetles, we actually have more flea beetles per plant. So this gives us some information on how to organize our intercrops, and maybe we can have a, a non-host plant maybe only every meter and maybe not quite as dense as this. So these are the things that are in the literature, and anyways, it does give us a much better picture that intercropping can probably even provide benefits to this very difficult to control endemic pest in the prairies of Canada. And this is again from the review here. They actually looked at a number of different legumes with brassicas, and they found very hopeful results from other studies where flea beetles were just not as active, and other insects as well. And they ended off again with kind of a framework of trying to understand the processes that were involved. If you look at a sole crucifer crop, um, and what it offers in the intercrop, it's a way to help us plan and to understand. And this is something we talked about last class, the push-pull system. I just wanted to come back to it to remind us that this system is very much about growing plants with maize or sorghum that repel the stem borer, and then you push that pest out of the field and then into the napier grass or molasses grass, which pulls the insect and destroys it. And since we had the module 4, we had a guest join us, Letitia Makungu, and she alerted me to this video on push-pull systems. And so I'm putting it into module 5, and you may want to watch how this system was developed in Western Kenya, and how it is also now moving into the drier areas of Kenya. And so that is exciting. Okay. We talked about intercropping with plants very close together. I want to now give you an example where we're intercropping, but there's actually quite wide strips of crops. So this is an example that comes from courtesy of some farming colleagues in Quebec who have a large organic farm. And of course, in North America, we have mechanized agriculture. So things like having wide strips where you can actually use the standard farm machinery is a big advantage. And so what they did is took a 200-acre field and they had it in strips of of corn or maize, soybeans, winter wheat, and the fallow is just the period after the winter wheat is harvested. It's not a whole year of fallow, and and then grew those crops in strips. So it'd be a strip of maize, a strip of wheat, and a strip of soybean, et cetera, et cetera. And they were interested in working with the local scientists, and so the work was actually published. So what did they find? Well, if we look on the left-hand graph here, the green line is approximately the economic threshold of the number of soybean aphids per plant. And soybeans are planted usually the middle of May. So we can see by the end of June, we see aphid numbers starting to increase. There's a food source. And where do they increase the most? In the control field, where there's just a large field of a single crop. You can see it goes up and then eventually it comes down. And it comes down because the natural enemy, which is the ladybug, you can see here in the triangle, you can see that ladybugs go way up in the single field, and that coincides with bringing this population down. So it works, but the problem is we've had a lot of economic damage. If we look at even a 36-meter strip, we can see our aphid population going up, um, but the population of predators goes up much faster because now what's happening there? The predators are moving out of the winter wheat into the soybean. So they're already in the winter wheat and they only have to go, 10 meters from either direction or maybe 30 meters. And that's actually what they're capable of. And then if you look at the 18-meter strips, well, that's the best scenario, and we can see the predators going up very quickly, and the aphids are held in check. So it's another example of how diversity deals with insects. So I'll give you a moment to pause the video and to stop and think about, what interests you here and plant those seeds into the soil. All right, let's move on. I like this statement by Hatt and Doering, who say that relying on regulating processes in agroecosystems to control pests is perceived as risky. Because I think that's how a lot of farmers view it. They go, yes, that's very nice in principle, that's going to work, but all of a sudden I have pests and I just have to spray them because I'm not comfortable leaving them there or waiting for some predator to show up. And that that reluctance to really dive into this, to trust that ecological system is probably why pesticide-based plant protection remains the norm, even in the so-called IPM systems, the integrated pest management systems, where using a pesticide should be considered the last resort, but often it's not. We just don't have the patience to wait for that. And so, the authors say there is room for improvement. And the room for improvement, one of them is that we need to know more about the ecology of our system and the characteristics or the traits of what we're dealing with. And so there's a couple of examples here: weeds, biomass, flowers, and ground cover. I just want to give a little bit of an example of each one. So, what is in the literature, which means people have done research on this, is that for the temperate regions of the world, which is Northern Europe and Canada and Northern China and those places, there are some weeds that really don't cost the plant a lot of yield. And so having them is not a big deal. And in fact, these authors here have discovered that 10% ground cover of these smiling weeds in winter wheat actually support higher trophic groups, leading to biological pest control. So they can provide other ecological services. Now, there are weeds that are a real problem: Canada thistle, dock, as examples. And of course, these you want to control. So this is an example of actually knowing what organism is out there. weeds are not just weeds. They're not all the same. And that's the point that they're making. We need to understand the characteristics. Here's another example. We're talking here about both ground cover and allelopathy. So here we have fall rye growing between the rows of soybeans. This is work of Virginia Jansen and my colleague, Dr. Yvonne Lawley. And here they have terminated the rye, and they're asking the question, are they getting any weed control from those residues? Um, there's certainly not enough residue there to physically smother weeds or suppress them, but is there a chemical from that might help? And to answer that question, we actually go to a past graduate student, Heather Flood, who worked with me 15 years or so ago, and she was interested in looking at the allelopathic chemicals from very small amounts of rye and wheat and triticale seedlings. And so um, she grew these seedlings in the field to about the 4-leaf stage, and then she harvested them, extracted, just extracted through just a water the material out of the leaves and put it in a petri dish and put red root pigweed and green foxtail, these are weeds, and navy bean seeds into the different petri dishes. And she had a water control. I'm spending a little bit of time on this data because I think it shows us that nuance, that how understanding the trait can be important. Okay, so if we look at red root pigweed, which is a significant problem in bean production, it's an amaranth species. If we look at the water control, we had 86% germination. Okay, so that's what we'd expect. If we had extract of fall rye leaves, we dropped that germination by 50%. If we looked at, triticale and winter wheat were about the same. So these plants were very effective at suppressing red root pigweed, similar effects on this Setaria weed. So what people write about in review papers that rye has allelopathic properties is true, and so does winter wheat and triticale. And then if we look at our crop, let's just take a look at experiment 1 because the effect was kind of the same in both experiments. When the bean seeds were put in the petri dish, we had 88% germination. Very good. Rye, 88%. That means the rye, it hurt the weeds, but it did not affect the beans. But if we look at winter wheat, it dropped the germination of the beans down to 30%. So it's a big problem. We can use it for red root pigweed, but it's going to hurt the beans. So that's not a really good idea. And then what's really fascinating is triticale, which is a cross between wheat and rye, had an intermediate level of negative effect on bean germination. And so this shows us that probably the triticale is bringing the genes from both rye and wheat together, perhaps in equal portion, and giving us this intermediate response. And it happened in 2 consecutive experiments. This is a lot of detail, and you can always read the paper if you want, but the point here is that understanding scientifically the traits that are involved in these systems, like you see here, is really important. And we need to understand those things so we can give farmers the proper advice on what to use and what not to use. And this bottom table here just shows the effect of rye on weeds, and it's basically the same effect. Then we have the flower structure of the plants that we might plant next to our field to harbor beneficial insects. We know that the structure of the flower is important because some insects have long snouts and some have short snouts. And so again, the devil is in the details. We also need to know who's there. And I want to give you this example of corabid beetles. This species there are many species of carabids, but this genera of insects is, uh, I'm not an entomologist, but I have collaborated with entomologists who say this is a very good indicator of um, sort of agroecosystem health. And we trap these by using a system like this. It's very simple, and these get put into fields, and you leave them there for a certain period of time, and then you can identify what carabids. And here is a former graduate student, Shauna Humble, doing this, and she's identifying the different species that came out of the different crop rotations. And what we found in the work is that um, the different crop rotations had very different species diversity of ground beetles. And we also found that the total beetle capture was greatest in the systems that had the most diverse plant population, which were in our case, the organic grain rotations. So the beetles eat weed seeds. They also eat grasshopper eggs, and so they are a very good indicator of um, what's happening in the ecosystem. And in Shauna Humble's master's work, she was actually able to associate different beetles with different weed species because they appear to be specialists looking at certain weeds. So um, again, it's important to understand the ecosystem. So that's a bit about the traits. This picture, beautiful picture, um, shows one of these, what we call a floral strip through a farming system in Canada. And um, the idea is to bring a lot of diversity of flowers, and that will attract parasitoids, which will attack crop pests in the adjacent fields. And sometimes we can make the non-crop areas, we can leave them sort of natural, we can purpose plant very flowery plants, or we might even put in some fruit trees. So there are a number of different options. But what we are trying to achieve with these is to build up the population of these parasitoids, and here they are listed, which actually feed on these pests. And so, um, well, when you look at this, using an insecticide is easier. There's no question about it, because how do I know what these look like? And are they going to be there when the armyworm shows up to eat my canola? So I'm going to give you an example later on, which I think shows us how we start actually managing this on a farm. But the first thing to know is know what's there. And so for farmers in Canada, maybe what they need is not just a crop scout who can tell them what weeds are there or what their soil nitrogen content is, but actually tell them what insects are out there. So that crop advisor should have a sweep net with them so they can do parasitoid monitoring. And there are resources in our province here which can be very, very helpful to even just know what they look like. Okay, so I'll let you pause and think about the traits, the nuances, or what did I say? The devil is in the details. But the details are now becoming more ecological, more about natural systems. I want to continue on this theme that there is room for improvement and reiterate this statement that Hart and Döring made earlier, that relying on regulating processes in agroecosystems, like having parasitoids eat your pest instead of using an insecticide, is perceived as risky. Well, it is if we don't know what we're doing. And I put myself in that position because I am not trained in this area. I've sort of learned it going along because I've found it to be interesting and useful. And also some of our pesticides aren't working that well anymore. But to make this work, you have to know the ecology of the system. And I'm going to give you this example from beautiful Lake Louise in Canada. And the lake was restocked with native trout fish. Okay, so there's a big lake under the ice. And this increased the eagle population. And I was surprised to learn that eagles also attack mountain goats, which live in the surrounding mountains. And so the mountain goat population was affected by restocking the lake with fish. And I just share that with you because everything is connected within ecosystems. And this is just an illustration. And we have to understand that if we're going to do agroecological engineering. And by the way, there's a nice YouTube video which shows the eagles actually killing mountain goats. But the example that I want to focus on today regards coffee production. Coffee is a fascinating plant because, first of all, it is the agricultural commodity that's the most valuable international traded commodity in the world. Its trade is more valuable than wheat, maize, soybeans, animal products, and it is it is the largest agroecosystem in the tropics. It supports a lot of small farmers with livelihood, but it's a native plant which likes shade. And we talked about shade in the last lecture when we talked about shade plants and sun plants. And so I want to just touch on the work of these two individuals, John Vandermeer and Iveta Perfecto, who are based in the United States, in Michigan, and they have spent their lifetime working on the ecology of coffee production. So let's begin. What struck these authors is they came to Latin America, which is what we call Central America, and they saw sort of this unshaded monoculture coffee, where coffee plantations had been placed into areas that used to be rainforest, essentially, or dry forest. And but in fact, coffee in its natural state was grown more like this rustic coffee within a canopy of native trees. And there's all kinds of other versions. There's shaded monoculture. And if we travel into the tropics, we see a lot of, for example, tomatoes grown under shade cloths. We see vanilla grown under shade. So maybe we should just grow those plants in a forest and provide the shade naturally, and that would allow for better birds, habitat, etc. So there's been a recognition that biodiversity loss in these coffee landscapes was because people moved from this natural system to this monoculture system. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now, when these scientists looked into the coffee ecosystem, they saw a lot of activity. They saw coffee scale, which are eating some of the leaves. They noticed a white halo fungus, which is actually attacking the coffee scale. They saw these lady beetle predators eating a scale insect. They saw a coffee berry borer taking the nutrition out of what would become a nice mature coffee bean. They saw coffee leaves infested with rust, which is a fungus. And they saw ants on the ground strategically placed around coffee trees. And, think about agricultural production systems that you walk into, whether it's maize, whether it's wheat, whether it's an apple orchard. we can kind of see the same thing. We've got this disease, we've got that insect, we've got also weeds, and we may have things like ants or earthworms, and we don't quite know how they fit in. All right. So the first thing that the researchers found is the very interesting pattern of ant colonies. And so we'll just leave it at that. They noticed that the ants were kind of critically strategically placed around the trees. And um, I'm going to skip this slide. Well, maybe I'll just go to it. So they were understanding more about how this ecosystem worked. And by the way, this is a rustic coffee, and here's a monoculture coffee with shade planted, sort of purpose planted. And what they found is the shading actually started to pay dividends. And they started to see some of the problems go away when they started investigating the problems within these coffee systems. And so we're able to identify key aspects of shade coffee, um, and they're listed here. And of course, the farmers are really important because they're the ones managing the coffee and they're the ones making a livelihood from the coffee. So, so we saw shade coffee production increase, and we can go into any grocery store in Canada and buy shade coffee, and you're getting it from a more ecologically intact um, ecosystem where it's bird friendly, et cetera, et cetera. But the scientists were not just interested in the fact that it did work, they wanted to know why it works. How does it all fit together? And so I'm not going to explain this table, this graph again, but I'm just using this slide to, to, to illustrate this. So I don't have time to explain the entire story because we're talking about these people's lifetime of work. But I want to highlight two papers that they wrote 10 years apart. This first one was in 2010, and here they had actually constructed the interaction network that results in, here's the interesting term, autonomous pest control. Four pests are shown in rectangles: the berry borer, the scale insect, the coffee rust, and the leaf miner. Okay. Um, the ants are here, and they are a keystone species, and they're linked to many, many different things. So I don't necessarily want you to memorize. We're not here to memorize this and to try to deconstruct it. Um, I'm showing it to you as inspiration and instruction. It's inspiration because of look at the amazing work they did to understand how this ecosystem could function to, what's the term? Autonomous pest control. And and secondly, to show that this is what your agronomist or maybe your agroecologist who comes and works on your farm needs to be able to show you. They need to show you how all these things fit together so that you do get flea beetle control in your canola. And I like what they said in this 2010 paper. They said, in the end, this model suggests that the vision of the natural world as harmonious and balanced is wrong if we accept the unreconstructed Newtonian worldview of balance. Its ecosystems are not like a marble coming to restate the bottom of an inverted cone, right? That's how we often think, cause and effect. However, through the spatially explicit complexity of myriad interactions, many of which are nonlinear, a higher notion of balance emerges, not the balance of Newton. You can look up Newton, if you want to learn more about Newtonian thinking, but rather the balance of a shifting sand dune whose detailed structure changes minute to minute, but whose fundamental nature as a sand dune is never in doubt. And 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 so this always exists, but it exists slightly differently in time and space. Our understanding becomes not the crude positivist logic that must identify a singular enemy to conquer and a magic bullet with which to do so, but rather the holistic vision of a new kind of balance emerging from the very complexity that traditional farmers intuitively understood from the beginning. So this reminds me of that T.S. Eliot poem where we sort of come back home for the first time. Okay, so that's it's really introducing ecological thinking. So if you hire somebody for your farm to scout your crops, which is a term that's used in Canada a lot, what this is telling us is that we really need an agroecologist to go along with that person so they can actually understand the relationships and then manage this in an economic farming system. Okay, they write 10 years later. This is what they write. Almost 10 years ago, some of us published a summary of this overall system. That's the paper I just showed you, suggesting that understanding it required more than just an identification of who eats whom. Then they drew another map, emphasizing the point. They're extending the diagram, including all the components. And then they went on to say that the whether an ecological community is controlled from above or below continues generating interesting research questions and takes on especially important meaning in agroecosystems. We describe the regulation from above of 3 coffee herbivores, a leaf herbivore, and a seed predator, and a plant pathogen by various natural enemies, emphasizing the remarkable complexity involved. So they're celebrating what they knew. They knew this stuff in 2010, but now they're thinking about it more. And they're starting to add, different sort of mathematical ways and trying to, come up with predictions. So farmers might have an app that tells them, if you see this many as teca at this time of year, maybe it means this will happen to the coffee berry, et cetera. And so we emphasize the intersection of this classical question of ecology, okay, which is this, with the burgeoning field of complex systems, including references to chaos, critical transition, hysteresis, all these things that computer scientists think about, and people who work on AI and that type of thing. And they actually they actually called it Turinian sort of thinking. And Alan Turing was the person who helped crack the Enigma code in the Second World War. And this was made into a movie. And you can learn more about Alan Turing here. So, um, maybe in the future, there will be an app for this where you can look at the number of small ants or the number of coffee rust and and you can actually manage this easier. So it'll be interesting to see what people write in the next 10 years. Now, an exciting part of this story is that it is so complicated. How are you possibly going to understand it, and how are farmers supposed to work with this? Well, what the authors did, you can see Luis Garcia Barrios and Iveta Perfecto and John Vandermeer actually came up with a game. And this game allows farmers to get these tokens for the different components of the system. And you can take a look at this paper and they can then help understand the interaction. So kind of playing chess using a real live coffee agroecosystem. So I think this is a story that is inspiring and it should motivate us to use this approach in other agroecosystems. So for example, in canola production. Canola is Canada's most important crop, maybe in maize production, which is probably the most important food crop in many African countries. What can we do to understand the interactions and then actually, have some fun with different scenarios? And I would say that the farmers might find exceptions to the rules that are built into this game, thereby adding new knowledge to this model. So lots to think about there. So you can pause the module and plant your ideas into the soil. And then we'll just end with a couple of three slides where I just want to remind us that what we've done is we've embraced complexity, and the coffee agroecosystem is really important. We use the tools of diversity to actually have an effect on this complexity so that it translates into the maximum socioeconomic benefits. So for university students, what we're going to get them thinking about is when we use these tools and we try to move it into here, this way, if you follow my arrow, we do need to know something about functional traits. And that example with the rye and the triticale and the allelopathy is just one little example of actually understanding the details so that you can actually have a practical system that farmers are actually going to be interested in. And then I want to encourage us to imagine what these landscapes, what these farm landscapes might look like. And I'm just using this slide from, I think, probably the first or the second module. And remember, I talked about Dr. Joan Nassar, Perception and Design Lab in Michigan. And what I want you to do is to imagine a landscape on a piece of land that you might be familiar with, that is dear to you, and try to use as many of the tools and understand as many of the connections that you can to come out with a good socioeconomic outcome. So what I want you to do, just for fun, is to design a farm or a field that employs many helpful interactions and provides benefits to farmers. And this is the one that I came up with. It's not perfect, but I'll just explain quickly. I've got a field here. I've got surrounding trees, which are going to actually bring birds in, and those birds are going to bring nutrients with them and drop the nutrients down here by the trees. I'm going to have animals actually grazing around the trees, but I'm going to have the animals at nighttime spend their time in the field so they can drop their nutrients there. So they're moving the nutrients from the tree row into the field. We've got deep-rooted plants which lift nutrients. So this example that I'm showing you is very much focused on nutrients, maybe a bit of diversity. Now I want you to add pest regulation, autonomous pest regulation, if you can. So that is your challenge. So that brings us to the end of module 5. I hope you feel inspired to be an agroecological engineer. I wish you well on that. And I'm going to share one more detail here. And, I wasn't quite ready for it. So it'll take me just a moment to find it, but it will be worth it. Okay, here it is. Good. Share my screen, and here I'm actually sharing my email. Ignore the other emails there, please. But what I've done is I have sent all of the certificate students this link, and I would like you to open this up. So you just click on there. I'll do that in a minute. And I'd like you to put the questions and comments that you've accumulated over the first 5 modules now in there. I'd like you to do that by March 3rd, and we can Visit all those questions on March 6th, and we're going to try to answer each one of your questions and respond to each one of your comments. So people are already starting to leave questions in here. That's fantastic. Please do that. It'll be wonderful. So I wish you a wonderful evening, morning, or afternoon. Take care.